Growing up Unitarian Universalist in central Illinois, I was told I was going to hell a lot. I was told this mostly by my friends. They would go away to Bible camp and they would send me postcards trying to save my soul. Because they understood the Bible to be one coherent book written by God with clear instructions about how to go to heaven. And I was an unbeliever. Well, when I finally joined them at Bible camp, because one of the forces strong enough in my 12-year-old life was to do anything my friends were all doing, I remained an unbeliever, and I was the only kid in the entire camp who did not turn my heart over to Jesus, much to the disappointment of the teenage camp counselor who was trying to manipulate me into doing so that they could have a perfect record. I explained that I was Unitarian Universalist, and that was not how we did things. But honestly, my church did not give me much of a counter-narrative about the Bible. It was sort of like, yeah, those stories are whack. Don't take them too seriously. We're too much educated for that. I ended up going to a private liberal arts college, and I met there a bunch of folks of all different faiths getting involved in the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life, including a bunch of progressive Christians who I befriended. And there I learned that there were other ways to interpret the Bible from a Christian lens. You could see it as a collection of ancient texts in their cultural context that were about a God who is love. And you could take it metaphorically, but still seriously. And I thought that was very nice, but I was still not sold, because these stories seemed very wide-ranging and a little all over the place, and some were kind of scary, and I was still an unbeliever. Then I ended up at a Christian seminary. I intended to go to a Unitarian Universalist seminary, but they didn't have any money at those, so I went to a Christian seminary. And at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, that's where I really started to dive deep into the Bible, because I was required to. And that's where I started to learn about the deep history of these texts, and that there's so many theories about how they came together, the oral histories that turned into written texts, the way that in a single little fragment of the Bible you could see two different sources woven together. And I began to learn about these stories as the meaning-making stories of a people struggling with violence and oppression and empire and occupation. And I began to understand about how the Babylonian exile informed so much of the Hebrew scriptures, grappling with what it meant to be a people displaced, ripped away from temple and culture. And how so much of the Christian scriptures and the New Testament Gospels were about a man who was saying, don't worship Caesar, don't follow the Roman Empire, worship a different God. Worship a God that says we are equal, even though we are occupied by the Roman Empire. Now that was pretty compelling to me, and I became a believer. I joined my seminary's gospel choir, and I started going to chapel every day at noon, and I started to get into the Christian liturgical year, seasons like Advent before Christmas and Lent before Easter. And so fast forward more years, and I'm part of a small group Christian community in Jamaica Plain. And when we gather in small group worship, we would read the gospel text from the lectionary. The lectionary being sort of like the Torah portion in Judaism, like a text that many Christian communities all read the same Sunday in a 3-year cycle. The text we had read earlier is the lectionary gospel passage from the lectionary for this week. And I found the Bible comforting in this context. I liked passages like the one we read today about blessings for the merciful and the meek, and reminders that people might persecute you for following your faith, but you're in a long tradition of people who are persecuted for doing what their faith called them to do. So I thought that I might get baptized and become a real believer. But I was still on the fence. Did I take the Bible seriously enough? I found it to be a nice text to have as part of my spiritual practice, but was it really central? Was I a believer or an unbeliever? Of course, that was not really that important of a question. All of us who are gathered here are believers. We are believers in community, believers in love. We are believers in the power of being together, or we wouldn't be here. And maybe you also believe in other things. Maybe, like me, you believe in creating a world without prisons, without police, without borders, without wars. Maybe, like me, you believe that governments should not be funding weapons and death. Maybe, like me, you long for a world where all people can be free. I believe in all of those things. And I believe in stories that help us to find hope and courage when we need it most. And that's what I like about the Bible. And that's also what I like about Star Wars. I first came to be interested in Star Wars because my cousin, who's 10 years older than me, was a Star Wars fanatic. And she remains one to this day, like rooms of her house dedicated to Star Wars, many costumes, high level. But long after I realized my cousin was not as cool as I thought she was when I was 4, I still liked Star Wars. And for anyone who's not familiar with Star Wars, it's the story of a ragtag band of rebels in a sci-fi fantasy galaxy who are battling an evil empire in many different iterations over time and different storylines, but they're always the rebels battling the evil empire. And in fact, my favorite piece of Star Wars media so far that I've encountered is the more recent TV series Andor. And one thing about that series is that, some Andor fans in the house. We love Andor. It's very good. It's very good. And one of the things about Andor that I thought was interesting when I was reflecting on it is that it doesn't have the Force. Like, nobody uses the Force in Andor. The Force being this, like, mystical, magical power that the special spiritual Jedis use to, like, move objects with their mind and, like, use lightsabers and stuff. It is cool. The Force is very cool. But it's not necessary for Star Wars. Because the heart of Star Wars is battling the evil empire. And that's how I feel about the Bible. You don't need all the mystical, magical stuff, because the heart of these stories is battling the evil empire. I think that we need these stories now more than ever. As we're in an ongoing pandemic, with increasing climate change, with rising fascism, we find ourselves in a moment of so much grief and trauma and violence. And I need stories that give me hope and courage. As I hear stories from my Muslim friends about street harassment, about people being spit on right here in Harvard Square for being perceived as Muslim. As I hear stories from my Jewish friends about how they're experiencing types of anti-Semitism they'd never experienced in their life. As I prepare to gather with people tomorrow to pray and sing for a ceasefire, I need these stories. And the thing is, these stories don't have to just be ancient scripture or sci-fi movies. They can be a lot of things. They can be like the novel I just read recently, recommended to me by a friend, that was a historical fantasy about, get it, combating empire. This time it was the British Empire. They were the evil empire. But it was an amazing novel. Babel, recommend it. Or they could be stories about your own family members. I think about my paternal grandfather and how he tried to unionize truck drivers for Coca-Cola, and how he was framed for theft and fired and threatened, and he kept fighting. And today is a day in some traditions and some cultures where people honor the dead, or people honor their ancestors. And it can be a good thing to do, to take a moment to think about the stories from our spiritual and biological ancestors that inspire us too. But whatever these stories are, we here are believers. We may be unbelievers in biblical literalism. We may be unbelievers in some supernatural aspects of ancient texts. We may reject the patriarchy and the hierarchies and the violence that are embedded in these texts, but we here are believers. Believers in community and love and justice. And we have the stories that we need to live with integrity in these impossible times.
Let me leave you with this charge from Annie. Tell the stories you believe in, the ancient ones your people have told for generations, the family tales. Revisit the stories that help you move through and with the fear, the grief, the despair, the movies and novels, TV shows and podcasts, the stories that remind you it is possible to live with integrity and love, even in these impossible times.